welcome to another edition of GNet TV News Project In Depth. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNet. It's my pleasure to have with us today Mr. Scott Milne, who is running for the U.S. Senate against incumbent Pat Leahy, and we're delighted to have him with us here today to talk about the race, the campaign, the issues that he's running on, and in preparation, hopefully inform you voters as well as you go to the polls on November 8th. Mr. Milne, welcome back to GNet.
Yes, it's great to be back with you,
We had you here 2 years ago, yes, when you were running against Governor Shumlin, and as of course many of our viewers know, almost defeated him in a very narrow election, losing I think by about 2,500 votes. Very long shot bid. I know few people gave you much of a chance in that race, but lo and behold, things wound up going into the state legislature.
Right.
So before it was decided. So. That must have been an interesting experience for you, and I guess must have given you a taste for some long shot races, because running against Pat Leahy is no simple task either.
Right.
Was 7-term incumbent now. He's been in the Senate since 1975. I believe the longest serving U.S. senator in the Senate. So what gave you the idea of throwing your hat in that particular ring? Is it just that you felt that after 40 plus years of being in the Senate that it was time for Mr. Leahy to come back to Vermont, or what was the motivator?
Yeah, great question, Andrew. Thank you. First of all, and perhaps most importantly, I want to say, inside my inner circle, we think we turned the corner and really started picking up momentum in the last race with your interview. So I'm looking forward to repeating. We've only got I don't know when it's going to air, but from filming we got about 11 days left. So. Really need to turn on the juice, so thank you for letting us come in today.
My pleasure.
I would say, maybe just for perspective, I thought in 2014 I was really lucky to be in the right place at an important time in Vermont history. I thought that we had an awful lot of the political class telling us that, specifically telling, I'm quoting exactly, that Peter Shumlin could be governor for life. I think we heard that in 2013, that could be 100 years before we saw another Republican governor. We heard that from a Middlebury College professor, I think in 2011. And what I saw was a state that I thought was headed in the wrong direction. It looked, as we got towards the end of May in 2014, that the Republican Party might be represented by a nice lady, but a marijuana issue, single issue candidate. So I stepped forward, and I recognized the odds were long, but I thought it was important that folks that agreed with me had a voice, and I would say the result of that election, Andrew, was that I think we realized we weren't as outnumbered as we thought we were. Got a business background, as you know, wanted to get a return on investment, and looked at 2016, and what I would say about Senator Leahy is, as I looked at where we are now and imagine 10, 20 years from now, a great America, a great Vermont for my children and grandchildren, your grandchildren, and other people's grandchildren. To me, politically, the biggest impediment between me being as optimistic as possible about the future that was on a ballot in 2016 was Patrick Leahy. So I agree that it's hard. It would be the first time, I think, in U.S. history that a senior sitting member of the U.S. Senate loses. I think it's the first time, will be the first time in Vermont history since we've been popularly electing senators about 100 years ago. So we know we've got a tall order, but I do think there's a lot of things wrong in Washington. I think Patrick Leahy's a poster child for what's gone wrong in the last 50 years. And I'm offering a voice to Vermonters who feel like it's time for a change. And I think we got a campaign that's really designed to amplify that message.
Well, let me ask you this. Pat Leahy has been, as we said earlier, in Washington now for over 40 years, since 1975. He's a senior member of the U.S. Senate. He's in line to become a chairman of a powerful Senate committee should the Democrats recapture the Senate in 2 weeks or so. Why should Vermonters trade having someone who is that senior and in theory able to direct federal resources to Vermont and replace that person with someone who would be starting off as a freshman senator with relatively little seniority? I mean, what's the upside in that bargain?
Yeah, a functioning America that we're not leaving a country that's on the brink of financial collapse to our grandchildren. I would argue what's gone wrong over the last 50 years, last 42 years, to keep it in Patrick Leahy's realm. He replaced, as you know, George Aiken, who was a New England Republican. When Aiken was in the Senate, there were, depending on the year, but 10 to 20 New England Republicans and Dixie Democrats that kind of met in the middle, where you had these Democrats that you could say were more conservative than the most liberal Republicans and vice versa. George Aiken, people forget, but a lot of people remember, George Aiken was one of Lyndon Johnson's primary allies on getting Great Society civil rights legislation passed. He was a Republican from Vermont. What's happened over the last 50 years is this, what I would argue is a deadly concoction of special interest money funding career politicians, propping them up election after election. Pat Leahy is a poster child for that. George Aiken, for 34 years worth of statewide elections in Vermont, spent $5,000 total on elections. I'm running against a gentleman who has over $6 million in his war chest, charges lobbyists $5,000 a piece to sit around and have a cup of coffee with him in the morning or a cocktail with him in the afternoon. That's how he raises his $6 million. I think $3.4 million of his money comes from special interests, has come from special interests. About 90% of his money is from out-of-state and special interests. That is ruining America. I guess, you know, if you go back to Bob Dole, Andrew had a great quote, which was, businesses don't just donate money to candidates because they want good government, right? They want a return on their investment. And then, you know, a lot of people banter about Einstein, who had the quote, insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result.
Right.
So what we got is 50 years of political interests, special interests, stepping up and funding candidates. They're doing it over and over. I would argue they're not insane. They're smart. They're getting a great return on their investment. What they're getting is a seat at the table as legislation is written. We can look at the greatest issues of our time and see the root of special interest money at that. The opiate epidemic. Pharmaceutical companies have spent almost $1 billion lobbying people like Patrick Leahy over the last 7 years. I don't think you can argue clearly that there's not a connection between the mistakes that we've made in oversight of painkillers. Howard Dean from up the road in Burlington, Vermont 12 years ago, as a country doctor, governor, was warning America about it. Nobody paid attention in Washington, but they got $1 billion of pharmaceutical lobbying. Climate change, another, you know, as I talk about a lot, Andrew, our nation and our planet are in perilous times. Climate change, I would argue, is driven by fossil fuel industry lobbyists on one side, renewable energy lobbyists on the other side. They all get their senators. Everybody's polarized, and nothing gets done. I'll be a centrist New England Republican. I talked a little bit about the campaign that we designed. I'm not taking any special interest or PAC money. I haven't sent one email, direct mail piece, or made one phone call asking anybody for money. We'll get outspent about 100 to 1 in this election. We sat down and thought about, you know, I don't want to be insulting of U.S. senators, but I don't just want to be a rinky-dink United States senator. How do we run this campaign, which has long odds anyway, but let's leverage the long odds into how can we optimize my ability as a messenger from Vermont to actually get something done.
Well, let's talk about a couple of issues, and some of which you've raised here today and also on your website. But one of the things I was interested in hearing you discuss is the whole EB-5 question. As many of us know, the EB-5 is a program that attempts to channel some foreign investment money into economic development projects, and one of them, of course, was the one up in northern Vermont at Jay Peak and a few towns around there. Kind of came apart and was revealed to be a bit of a Ponzi scheme, I guess, is one of the terms that's been used to describe it. If you're elected, would you, and I raise this, of course, because Pat Leahy has been, you know, closely associated with the program. He's defended it before on some occasions, been a champion of it, I think it's fair to say. If you were elected, would you favor continuing the program as is, or making a few changes, or scrapping it altogether as just not working the way it's supposed to? Sure.
First of all, we challenged Patrick Leahy in May of this year to release all his emails and office communications with the SEC, with the regulators, with the principals, not only in the Northeast Kingdom, but around the country. Hollywood, has about Motion Pictures Association of America is Patrick Leahy's biggest donor. His daughter is a lobbyist for Hollywood interest before his committee, and there's a lot of EB5 interest there. So I think it's important, as you said, Patrick Leahy describes himself at times as the godfather of the EB5 program, at other times as the leading champion in the United States Senate. I think it's very important to see transparency from the sitting United States senators so we know what went wrong and we can understand how to fix it. Philosophically, I think there's a slot in our immigration program for a program like EB5. It does need to be fixed, but before we know what the fixes are, we need to learn from the mistakes that Patrick Leahy made. One interesting thing a lot of people don't realize, Harry Reid's son is involved as a principal in the EB5 program that's in scandal. Hillary Clinton's brother is involved in an EB5 program that's involved in a scandal.
These are in other states.
In other states. Pat Leahy's daughter's a lobbyist for EB5 interests from Hollywood. It's almost like it's a club that senators came up with to get jobs for their relatives.
I wanted to ask you about a few other things that seem to be central to the campaign. You mentioned earlier the whole idea around campaign cash contributions and money in politics. If you're elected, what would you do to change that system to eliminate corporate donations, flowing into political coffers? Citizens United, the Supreme Court decision of a few years back, was widely regarded as being the thing that really opened the floodgates around all that, where super PACs could, funnel money into candidates. What is your thought on how we reverse that or eliminate that?
Special interest money propping up career politicians election after election is ruining our country. We've designed a campaign to amplify the message that needs to change. And I would argue, Andrew, and ask your viewers to at least take seriously that I absolutely positively believe this. Our campaign, if I'm successful by being outspent 100 to 1, not even soliciting donations, say nothing of accepting special interest donations, I believe will send a loud and clear message across the halls of Congress and across the country that we're sick and tired of the way campaign finances work now and it needs to change. I have national campaign finance reform folks paying a lot of attention to our race. So I think what I believe is, if you believe what I believe, which is this special interest money is bad for us, it needs to change if we're going to be a healthy, happy country 10 or 15 years from now. After the votes are counted, if I win, I'll do more to positively affect the future of improving the way campaigns are financed in America than any senator will do over the next 6 years. So that'll be a great thing. And we've got a specific, a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. I think is important. It's a lot of work. We've got some other strategies around it, and I'm clearly running on a platform of reforming the United States Senate.
So would candidates running for public office then rely on public financing for their campaigns? Right now we have the $1 checkoff thing on the IRS on your tax return, but my understanding is that the numbers of people who are checking off that box and giving $1 or $3 or whatever it is to help fund that is on the decline. Fewer people are doing that now than they did 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah.
But is public financing alone going to be sufficient to help candidates, particularly someone like yourself who's running, well, not for the first time, but let's say, name recognition may be an issue for them. They need more money to get their name out there. Is that going to be good enough to kind of level the playing field?
I think it's going to get this dysfunctional, rigged political system that leads to a rigged economy on a much better track for America. How it actually pans out, I think we have proposals where if you agree to voluntary spending limits, you get some public financial assistance. It's a complicated issue. It's going to take a while to get through the Citizens United, but I believe if folks listen to my message and agree with me that it's a big problem that needs to change, we need to change the players that are there before it's going to change.
Mm-hmm. Now, you're also, I gather, in favor of term limits. You think U.S. senators, for instance, shouldn't serve more than 2 terms?
Right.
That's a message that, on one level, is, I'm sure, very attractive to a lot of people. But doesn't that also then mean that a state potentially can lose some advantages to having a senator who's there for a longer period of time and becomes a powerful player and can direct federal resources to a state like Vermont that might not otherwise get them?
I would say that the data does not support that Patrick Leahy brings home the bacon. There's 7 states with 1 congressional district. By most measures, we're number 6 as far as what we get for federal resources. In the whole scheme, if you just used dollar return for dollar invested, I think we're number 25 in the country or something like that. There's an inherent advantage baked into the Constitution for small states. There's a small state floor. Essentially, at the end of the day, we've got 1/500th or 1/600th of America's population, but 2% of the United States Senate. So that's going to be the same whether it's Scott Milne or Pat Leahy or Bernie Sanders or anybody else. I would argue with the rise of notoriety and influence of Bernie Sanders over the last 18 months, now's the perfect time to trade out Pat Leahy.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that kind of came up probably in an unintended way over the course of the presidential campaign when Donald Trump came out that he hadn't paid taxes for almost 20 years, 18 or 19, I think. There was a sort of at least a short spurt of discussion and interest in the idea that we should look at overhauling the tax code. This is an idea that comes up frequently, and you probably know better than I as a business person here in Vermont. But why is it so hard do you think, and I guess the question would be, if you're elected, would you be in favor of pushing for the so-called grand bargain, which is, I heard described, where corporate tax rates, for instance, are lowered somewhat in return for closing corporate loopholes and other mechanisms that can benefit particularly large corporations, apparently. Would that be something you would be fighting for if you were elected to try and kind of close those loopholes and lower the corporate tax rate, or begin to kind of create a situation where someone like Mr. Trump couldn't not pay taxes for 20 years?
I'm not running on an agenda of tax changes. 30 years ago, I was a flat tax, Pete DuPont and some of these people. I was paying a lot of attention to that. It made sense to me. I think we got bigger problems right now. I think we've got some competitive issues globally with our corporate tax rate that need to be looked at. But what I think and what I believe is, as a practical, moderate centrist in the United States Senate, I think grand bargains are important. I think we need a grand bargain on immigration. If some tax things need to be involved as well. What I'm not in favor of is coming up with an agenda to get elected that's going to make it sound like taxes are going to go down because you elect Milne. I think what we need to do is get a predictable U.S. government that's functioning correctly and isn't threatening to shut down every time a couple senators don't get their way. My opponent voted to shut down the government last month because he couldn't get his way on the EB-5 reforms. Fortunately, the government didn't shut down, but every time businesses hear that, they go, are we going to invest our money in America or this country that's stable? We're going to not invest any money in our plants in America until we figure out what's going on. That brings down economic activity across the whole country. That's what we need to get a government that, as Lincoln reminded us at Gettysburg, Andrew, of the people, by the people, and for the people. I think what we've seen with this deadly concoction of special interest money propping up career politicians election after election is we've become some version of a government of the people with money, by the people with power, for the people with money and power, and kind of the rest of us get left out and are way too much on our own, and that needs to change.
You mentioned immigration a moment ago, and that, of course, is another real hot button issue in the national election anyway. What would your prescription be for that? I mean, would we have a very tight limit on the number of folks that could come into the country? We've heard about the 11 million undocumented aliens. I assume that's a roughly accurate number. What should we do about the situation, or should we just try and send all those folks back to where they came from, or whatever?
Sure. I believe that we need to have a comprehensive immigration reform. I think, again, 3 planks of Milne's platform: get dirty money out of politics, term limits, bridge the partisan divide. I'll be a centrist. George Aiken, who is one of my inspirations for running for office, had a great philosophy, which was we can't be afraid of Me Tooism, which is the other side gets a good idea all too often today, but this was 50 years ago when Aiken said it. We can't be afraid to say Me Too. That's what's wrong in the United States Senate right now, is if it's, as you saw when McConnell said our number one goal is to defeat Obama, make Obama a one-term president. The Democrats say the same thing about, it goes both ways, and it's just way too polarized. This Dixie Democrat, New England Republican that controlled things are extinct. I'll be in the middle. Hopefully we can get 5 more centrists. If we get 5 centrists in the United States Senate, I believe it's a game changer for America, especially if we can get special interest money out of the way at the same time. So immigration is something that I think is way too polarized, where everybody just uses it to get votes and worry about getting reelected and all this stuff. We need to get a secure border. We need to get a e-verify system for employment. We need to get a path to citizenship, in my opinion, for almost all of the 11 million people that are here, unless they've done something deplorable. And as far as what kind of system we have to get people into the country, I believe as with, obviously you and I are 2 very blessed people, right? To those who most is given, most is expected. I think that's a fundamental belief I have and most people have in life, and I think that's true for nations as well. America is the most blessed nation on earth, at least in the last 100 years. We've got a responsibility not only to enable people around the planet to aspire to something better, but we have a real responsibility to contribute to the economic and social fabric of every culture around the world, with the small caveat, as long as their government is either fully respecting human rights or working diligently towards getting there. And that's something that I believe very much, and I think immigration and having a sound, reasonable immigration policy that makes sense for folks in America that are threatened by employment from immigrants, but also that makes immigrants realize America is a truly great society that we want to aspire to be more like.
One of the, I suppose, litmus tests that's going to come up very quickly around the idea of sort of healing that polarized partisan divide that we've seen in Washington for the past few years anyway, if not longer, maybe it's more like the past couple of decades, is a question of the appointment of Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court. Right now, as you know, that's kind of up in limbo. The Republican majority in the U.S. Senate has refused to even have a vote on his appointment. That may or may not be settled in a lame duck session of the Congress following the election, or it may wind up, not being resolved until the new Congress is assembled in January. What would your recommendation be? Let's just say, for instance, that the lame duck session does not deal with Merrick Garland's appointment. Would you vote to, put him on the Supreme Court?
Well, I believe that presidents deserve great discretion in getting judicial and other cabinet level appointments through, as long as they're competent ethically and intellectually to do the job. In general, I'll be supporting them. I clearly think Garland should have got a hearing. I agree with you. It goes back 2 decades, 3 decades. It goes back to Robert Bork. Patrick Leahy and Ted Kennedy are the 2 guys that turned borking into a verb. To me, that was one of the early signs of this downward decline of hyperpartisanship. It's got Patrick Leahy's fingerprints all over it. It's another reason why Vermont and America is going to be better off with Scott Milne in the United States Senate.
We have time for about one more question, and it's one that we haven't talked about yet, but I know you also highlight it on your website, and that's the question of opiate reform. It's a big issue here in Vermont, perhaps one of the largest. I mean, there have been a lot of ideas floated about how we fix that. If it comes down to spending more money on building more treatment centers and improving access for folks to get help when they need it, not 4 or 5 days later, which seems to be the case all too often, that people make a phone call, I want help, I want to get off this stuff. Sorry, we can't, there's no one here available to help you today, there's no bed ready for you. It seems to me, anyway, that what that comes down to is a dollar and cents issue, that at some point more money needs to be spent to provide that. Is that in line with where you're coming from on this question, or do you have another way to approach it?
First of all, I would say there's a direct connection between special interest influence over legislation and the opiate epidemic, which we talked a little bit about before. I'm a little worried that the solution that we have for opiate problems is another drug that's a proprietary drug by pharmaceutical companies, and that pharmaceutical companies have too much of a seat at the table to figure out how to solve things. It does need a lot of money to be fixed. It should be a huge national priority, but we should get the special interests off the table. Should be health professionals, experts in addiction, and United States Congress people and senators that figure it out without somebody that's got a financial interest in it going one way or another. That's what's ruining our country. The opiate problem, we were in St. Johnsbury the other night, Andrew. A supporter stopped by who works in a prison. He said his guess is 90% of the people between 18 and 30 that come into the criminal justice system in northeastern Vermont have an addiction problem. So it's money well spent. I mean, it's a I thank God my kids are in their 20s. They never saw heroin. I don't think there's too many kids in their teens that go through schools in Vermont that don't know somebody that's got a heroin problem now. That's just in the last 10 or 12 years. I mean, it's hard to imagine where it's going, but it needs to be a national priority.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sure there's a lot more we could talk about for another 25 or so minutes, but just about out of time now. But I want to thank you, Mr. Milne, for stopping by today. Scott Milne is a businessman from Pomfret, Vermont, and he's running for the U.S. Senate against Pat Leahy. And you voters will decide the outcome on November 8th, or maybe even sooner, depending on how early you vote, since I guess a lot of folks are voting a lot earlier than the actual election day nowadays. But anyway, thank you again, Mr. Milne, for being with us. Always a pleasure to have you on the show. And
great to see you again.
Good luck.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all for watching as well. This has been the GNet TV News Project In Depth. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNet TV. Glad you could join us today, and we'll see you the next time.